Yeah, we might obviously give people a few minutes, but since you've got plenty of overheads and plenty of questions, maybe we'll start at 2 or 3 minutes past. If people are late, that's tough luck on them. Is that okay? But we just hang on for a couple of minutes.
Yeah, whatever you think best.
Is it nice and sunny across the country for everyone? Presumably not just in London.
Sunny day in Wales, not something you say every day.
Good. Okay, I think we should start because there are plenty of people already in. So, hello everyone. Welcome to the latest in our series of political psychology seminars. We've got two more, one in mid-May, one in the beginning of June. But delighted to welcome today Joe Phillips, used to be a colleague of mine at Kent. Sadly, Joe, well, luckily for Cardiff, but sadly for us, Joe is now at the University of Cardiff. And he's going to be talking to us today about the consequences of affective polarization. And Joe's a political scientist by training, but is certainly someone I consider to be a genuine political psychologist. And some of the people that he's working with on the slide there are psychology. So Joe is genuinely from the political psychology mixture of political science and psychology. So Joe, thank you very much. Normal rules. Joe will talk for up to 30 minutes and then we'll have about half an hour for questions. So Joe, many thanks. Look forward to what you're hearing what you're going to say, and over to you.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you all very much for having me, and thank you for taking time out of your day to be here. This is some work that colleagues from the University of Kent and I have done. In fact, I'm the only political scientist on this paper. The rest are all social psychologists. This paper is unofficially, not sponsored, brought to you by Cheez-It Snack Mix, the thing that I ate while running all of these models. So without further ado, here we go. So the literature on affective polarization is about 13 years old at this point. And for those who might not be as familiar with the concept, that's just the fancy term for disliking members of opposing political groups, in this case, opposing political parties. So why do scholars say that this type of phenomenon is important? Well, there are kind of two reasons, one of which is somewhat positive, one of which is less positive. On the positive end, people think, well, if you dislike the opposition, that's a sign that you at the very least hold some serious preferences over who should be governing, and that can motivate you to participate with politics and engage in politics via voting, via participatory acts beyond voting, via keeping up with politics, and to the extent that we consider participation a public good, then sort of anything, including kind of animosity, might, as you say, have a positive consequence. At the same time, there is the less positive purported consequence of affective polarization, which is that, well, if you hate and fear members of the other side enough, you might start believing such outlandish things about them that you might, say, stage an attempted coup, as some Republicans did in January of 2021, as pictured there. And if you take a look at some of the observational record, usually cross-sectional surveys or maybe panels with a couple of waves, more or less you see this story. So if you take a look at the observational literature, people who display relative dislike of the opposing political party relative to their own tend to be more politically interested, tend to turn out to vote more often. They also tend to engage in various acts beyond voting, such as trying to persuade others around them to vote a similar way. And so lots and lots of different types of political engagement that are stimulated by affective polarization. However, it also comes with a bit of that darker side in the observational literature. So you might find that people are less willing to give diffuse support to various sorts of institutions. People might be willing to close polling stations in areas where a lot of outpartisans might be. There at least is some worry, though there's mixed evidence as to this, as to whether people who dislike the other side more are more willing to accept political violence against their opponents. And so if you're just looking at these pieces of literature, kind of what scholars have been thinking this whole time has been validated. And why might we expect this? Well, one of them is just from traditional social identity theory. Partisan identities, any sort of political identity, can be a salient kind of social identity, something that we consider to be a part of ourselves. And just like a lot of other identities where competition pops up, well, that's when you see kind of identity conflict come in. And partisanship is one of those identities where competition chronically comes in. In democracies, we have regular elections, regular sites of competition between opposing political groups, which in some sense is zero sum. You know, any seat one party wins is a seat that other party is not winning. So we might see kind of these consequences emerge from there. We can also think about it in terms of Liliana Mason's sorting theories. So the idea that when political identities not only are strong in their own right, but also overlap quite a bit with other social identities that can be wrapped up in conflict, such as perhaps ethnic conflict or religious conflict or urban-rural conflict, that these conflicts tend to kind of multiply the more that they overlap. And so not only does sort of the investment in one's own party's success and perhaps investment in the other party's failure go up, but the perceived threat of what happens when the out party comes to office goes up. And we also might think of these consequences as reasonable from the political tolerance literature, where even though in the abstract, most people in advanced democracies in the abstract will support democratic rights to free speech, freedom of assembly, you name it, once you have a specific group who wants a specific thing, people start to make exceptions. And so it wouldn't be strange at all necessarily to think, hey, we might want to close polling stations where our opposition might be. So here's the question I'm going to be asking today. Is all this true? We have reason not to think it is. And so for those who, in the affective polarization literature, these two experiments represent a bit of a moment of panic. Both of them have in common that they used different types of interventions to reduce affective polarization and then see what it did to various survey measures of support for democratic norms. And what both of these sets of experiments came to the conclusion of is, well, we can seem to reliably reduce affective polarization, but none of the other sorts of democratic norm stuff is following. So what's happening there? Well, this is what this paper is trying to take care of. Brockman, Calla, and Westwood, so that's the first experiment over here, their particular account would argue that, well, in some sense, this should have been obvious. From their perspective, partisanship is just one dimension of judgment. Even if it's an incredibly important predictor of how people think about the political world and how people politically behave, it ultimately is just one dimension of how people judge office holders, of how people judge particular policies. And so, to some extent, we might have been overshooting the importance of party and therefore the importance of dislike of others based on party. And using partisan affect to make decisions, well, there's certainly room for it, but this particular dimension would come at the sacrifice of others, such as making considerations about the economy, for example. So outside of this sort of outside of sort of narrow survey questions, people might not, in practice, use their animosity toward the other side for a whole lot. But my co-authors and I have this idea that potentially more could be at play than this. So possibility number one, which admittedly is a bit of a copy possibility, in the sense that, if you don't want these experiments to be right, you can always say, well, not all experiments have external validity. I'm not going to go there in this sense. But Volka et al., the second experiment, did think to mention, hey, we used one particular type of intervention. The two experiments used different types of interventions. Perhaps these interventions don't have the downstream effects on democratic norms that others do, but other interventions might exist that do something different. Another kind of more thorny issue to deal with in the experimental environment is also the time lag. So it might be that how people feel about the opposing side just needs a little time to update other things, so that even if people do kind of chill out about their opposition, all of the other sorts of beliefs that go downstream of it might need to take a little bit of time to update. These often won't happen in these sorts of one-shot experiments, or even potentially in a couple of weeks of follow-up. And if that's the case, then at the very least, we should be seeing with longitudinal models, which leverage more natural variation, plus some noise, but also natural variation in affective polarization over various timescales, we should be kind of seeing in these other models some sort of downstream effect of affective polarization on other things. The other possibility is that observational world has befallen the same fate as a lot of literatures prior to the introduction of experiments, which is they were capturing correlation, not causation. So the type of people who are affectively polarized might be the types of people who are more politically engaged or have more flimsy commitments to democratic norms, but these are just the same kinds of people. It's not necessarily a causal process. So if this is the case, then we would expect that with more rigorous longitudinal methods that can separate between person and within person effects, that between person relationships would remain, but within person relationships would disappear. Now, of course, there's also, with any sort of cross-sectional model, the possibility of reverse causality. So the idea that affective polarization is a consequence and not a cause of what we think that it affects. So it might be that people who are more politically engaged end up having more, might have stronger preferences over their political friends and foes. People with more flimsy commitments to democratic norms might impute that their opposition also has those flimsy commitments and tend to dislike them more as a result. Now, of course, with anything else, bidirectional relationships are possible, but reverse causality would be the main thing that would produce this disjuncture between the experiments and the observational results. So to test between these possibilities, this is where the Cheez-It snack mix came in. We analyzed 23 observational data sets spanning almost 70 years of survey research in about, I think, 11 countries. These data sets combined have slightly over 300,000 people. Yep, and in order to even present these data, we ran a random effects meta-analysis on a bunch of things. So any sort of purported outcome of affective polarization in these various data sets, we ran a few different types of models on them. And so the first thing we kind of tested for was, well, is there a relationship between affective polarization and all these other things? And one contribution of this paper indeed is to not just look at democratic norms, of which we had 11 tests, but also various indicators of political engagement, as well as political trust. And so what we used here were two types of models, one of which are cross-lag panel models, and the other are random intercept cross-lag panel models. Now, what comparing these models is useful for is one of them, the first one, the cross-lag models, don't neatly separate between person variation from within person change, but random intercept cross-lag panel models do. Effectively, what you do with them is you essentially create a latent variable that contains all instances of a given measurement at each time. So if you have a three-wave panel, you have, say, a variable with three instances of affective polarization on it. And you repeat the same thing with the other variable, be it political interest, be it wanting to keep the president in office past the end of their term, any variable. And essentially what these latent variables do is center the variables at a within person mean. And so that any deviation from 0 on a given variable is a deviation from that within person mean, which does factor out a whole lot of things that might be contextual rather than within person, which is more causally sound. Another test that we ended up doing was looking at the direction of the association. And this is something, regardless of the model you're looking at, that cross-lag panel models, this family of models, can easily pick up. And that's just looking at the respective coefficients and seeing, okay, which thing seems to be coming before the other thing? Because, of course, reverse causality could be at play. Oh, I also say down here that these are done with random effects meta-analyses. We wouldn't have had time to go through the results otherwise. So without further ado, here we go. So here are the results for various indicators of political engagement. These are not all the indicators, but these are the ones that have, these are all the ones that have more than one study for that particular indicator, along with just the summary of all indicators of political engagement at the bottom here. On the horizontal axis is the magnitude of the effect, with the dashed line in the middle indicating an effect of 0. Anything where the 95% confidence intervals cross that line is an effect that's not statistically significantly different from 0. On the left are the effects of affective polarization, and the right plots have sort of the reverse paths, so the paths from discussion or participation to subsequent affective polarization. The models at the top are the run-of-the-mill cross-lag panel models, while the models at the bottom are the random intercept cross-lag panel models. So taking the cross-lag ones first, what we see here is, at least for kind of this composite indicator of engagement here, there seems to be this positive relationship between affective polarization and political engagement downstream. And if you drill down to specific types of engagement, it seems to really be concentrated among political discussion, acts of participation beyond voting, and political interest. It's a little bit harder to see, but they're also kind of small, very tightly estimated reverse paths. So it is also the case that people who are more politically engaged also become more affectively polarized downstream. But of course, these models don't neatly separate contextual and within-person change. So if we go down to the random intercept cross-lag panel models, things get a little bit dicier, which is to say that the effect of affective polarization goes away. However, it's a little bit hard to see. The reverse path does not. It's near 0 in terms of its effect, but it's not. The path does not contain 0. So there's at least some evidence, however small, that people who are more politically engaged do end up more affectively polarized down the line. Now, what about other sorts of things like institutional confidence? And I separate this from democratic norms because to have sort of general trust in government or general distrust is something that democracies can generally accommodate as long as they're not sort of at extreme levels. But people can and do differ in them. So what we find here is that even with the cross-lag panel models, we don't see a lot of consistent effects. So in the studies that we do have that had conspiracy mentality, people who are more affectively polarized tended to have greater conspiracy mentality downstream and vice versa. And people who are more affectively polarized tended to have a little bit less political trust. But if you just pool across all the indicators, there isn't much going on even with these models. And so once you have the random intercept cross-lag panel models, all of the stuff going on with conspiracy mentality goes away, though you do see a negative effect of affective polarization on cynicism, interestingly enough. But again, not to make too much of a mountain out of this molehill, when you're looking at these indicators in general, nothing much is happening. So for democratic norms, I have this depicted a little bit differently because unlike kind of these other indicators, almost nothing shows up more than once when it comes to various democratic norms variables. So things like wanting to keep Trump in office past his term obviously doesn't extend outside the United States in 2020. And so it's a little bit idiosyncratic. But anyway, what we see here is whether you're looking at the effect of affective polarization or kind of these reverse paths, regardless of the model you're looking at, all of these confidence intervals cross zero. That even with kind of the more forgiving model, you don't find a lot of association. And this is something that Vocal et al. 2023 also noticed, that even just sort of with the correlation matrices, there wasn't as tight of an association between affective polarization and democratic norm support as kind of what the literature has always said. So you might be thinking, well, you have a bunch of countries in your data, Joe. Are we not just seeing a US thing? So you might think, well, the US has increased the most in affective polarization, so they might have an unusually high amount of variation to leverage, so you might have a lot more statistical power there. Or you might think, well, they're so polarized now that laying on additional polarization doesn't do much, so let's look at the other countries. So we looked at that as a moderator of effects. Another thing we looked at for pretty similar reasons was start year. So you might imagine that in advanced democracies in the past, affective polarization wasn't as large. And though the United States was sort of the fastest growing in affective polarization, it also wasn't the only one that's grown. And so we also looked at that. And to kind of get to one potential critique of the experiments, we also looked at the average lag time between waves to see if findings were at all sensitive to that. And here we just have the composite engagement, institutional confidence, and democratic norms indicators just to keep things simple visually. And what we end up finding here is basically none of these things moderate effects. So across indicators, whether you're looking at the effect of affective polarization or the reverse paths, whether you're looking at the garden variety cross-lag models or the random intercept cross-lag models, not a lot of country difference. I think in one of the models, you do see that the reverse path gets stronger, and I believe it's from engagement to affective polarization over time, but we're talking about a very, very, very tiny effect. And the amount of lag time between the panels also does not have a significant moderating effect on any of these relationships here. But you might be thinking, well, there are lots of measures of affective polarization under the sun. And indeed, one sort of decision I made to keep it simple, to keep it consistent across countries, was to have those first analyses be done with measures of affective polarization, whether it's the Rajan measure or just a simple in-group minus out-group measure, depending on the party system, was to have something that essentially required an in-party. But there are other measures like the Wagner spread and Wagner distance measures that don't require an in-party. And you could also imagine just taking the absolute value of the difference between how people feel about one party versus the other. We imagine this is an in-group, out-group thing, but it might not be solely such. It could also just capture the spread of feeling about the parties. And so what happens when we do that? Well, we still get a whole lot of nothing when it comes to institutional confidence and democratic norms, but we find perhaps a little bit more of a sanguine story for political engagement, that regardless of the model you're looking at, the effective affective polarization on subsequent engagement is positive and significant, and same for the reverse path. With this one, it's even the case that with the RICLPMs, affective polarization actually has a little bit stronger of an effect with that, even with a more sort of rigorous modeling strategy. So at least something there. Another thing you might be thinking is, well, affective polarization. If it's a different score, then what you're really having are kind of two components at the very least, particularly if you're talking about partisans, in-party warmth, out-party warmth, each with their own errors. So we might be underestimating the extent to which things are happening due to the measurement error, but also in-party warmth and out-party warmth might be doing different things. You might think that that liking your own group might motivate engagement, but fear and hatred of the outgroup might motivate some of the democratic norm stuff. And if you just kind of mash these measures together, you might lose sight of their effects. So we also looked at these separately. And so what we saw was, again, a whole lot of nothing for institutional confidence in democratic norms. But at the very least, with RICLPMs, we did find in-party warmth predicted greater subsequent political engagement. For out-party warmth, you're going to see kind of the opposite direction of effects, because if disliking the out-party motivates engagement, then it'll be a negative effect, because out-party warmth's just coded higher value equals higher warmth. And we find that, yep, the RICLPMs show a reciprocal relationship between affective polarization and political engagement. And at least with the cross-lag model, not with the random intercept cross-lag model, to be clear, affective polarization is associated with greater institutional confidence, most of that driven by lower political cynicism, which we can talk about in the Q&A a little bit if people are interested. And so another kind of way of thinking about it is, well, you're looking so far at polarization, but what if the problem isn't hating one side? What if the problem is hating everyone? What if that's the real sort of black pill for democratic norms? Well, we have you covered there as well. And so we took average party system affect. So this was either the average of the two parties or a weighted average of multiple parties, depending on the country. And what we found was not a lot of robust stuff happening with democratic norms or engagement, but institutional confidence, there's more going on there with affect towards the parties as a whole, where people who have a greater average esteem for parties as a whole tend to have more institutional confidence. While the reverse path is significant for the cross-lag models, it's not such for the random intercept cross-lag models, though. So, with the title, what was this all much ado about nothing? I must say, one of my co-authors said that that was probably a bit of a hurtful title, and I should walk that back a little bit. The good news, though, is it's not quite much ado about nothing. That even with sort of running affective polarization through this ringer, we do find some effects some relationships that do sustain, namely with political engagement. Particularly the case that people who are more politically engaged tend to have higher levels of affective polarization. However, just like what the experiments found, institutional confidence, democratic norms, there isn't much going on relationship-wise between those things. So at the last bit of time, I'm going to talk about some possibilities for why we think this might be happening. One reason for these effects might be that the feeling thermometers that we use just might not be potent enough instruments for what we're really looking at. So we might need something like the partisan sectarianism scale, which Jamie Druckmann and colleagues, I believe, are developing at the moment. That might be necessary for some of the other things that we're seeing, not just simple low warmth towards opposing partisans, which might index preferences as much as they index anything else. The other thing might be the individual level's the wrong place to look. That, there seems to be some pretty credible evidence using more rigorous modeling strategies that polities that are more affectively polarized tend to be more democratic backsliding. And it might just be that this is a societal level phenomenon, not an individual level one, even though we've been studying it as such. Third and final possibility, and this is one that I've labeled a syndrome. People always ask, what's the syndrome? I don't know. It's not very well thought out, so I'm just calling it a citizenship style now, that perhaps having very strong opinions over political friend and foe is just one ingredient of a citizenship style that also contains political engagement and flimsy commitment to democratic norms. That what we're talking about is not necessarily causal, but more a sort of cocktail of things that go together that different structural conditions make more or less prevalent in a society. Not a very well thought out thing so much, but potentially something there. And so with that, thank you all for listening, and I look forward to your feedback. Thank you all.
Lovely. Thanks a lot, Joe. I'm just going to stop the